"That's impossible," Alexander Sterling whispered, his hand frozen on the music room doorknob. The sound coming from inside his mansion wasn't a recording. Someone was playing Chopin's most difficult nocturne with the skill of a concertmaster. But his housekeeper's 7-year-old daughter had never touched a piano in her life, or so he thought. When Billionaire CEO Alexander Sterling heard the haunting melody of Chopin's nocturne in E-flat major drifting from his mansion's music room, he assumed his housekeeper had left the radio on. But as he approached the grand Steinway piano that had sat silent for months, he discovered something that would shatter his carefully ordered world. There, on the velvet bench, sat 7-year-old Amara Johnson, the daughter of his housekeeper Keisha, her tiny fingers dancing across the keys with the skill of a concert pianist who had trained for decades. The music was flawless, each note perfectly weighted, each phrase breathing with emotion that seemed impossible from someone so young. But it wasn't just her extraordinary talent that stopped Alexander cold in his tracks. It was her eyes, those distinctive ocean blue eyes that stared back at him from his own mirror every morning. As Amara's hands stilled on the keys, and she turned toward him with a shy smile, 2 questions would haunt Alexander Sterling for the rest of his life. How could a child who had never had a piano lesson play like the greatest masters in history? And why did this little girl have his eyes? 7-year-old Amara Johnson lived in a world painted in muted colors. Her small apartment in the Riverside district was clean, but cramped with thin walls that barely contained the dreams of a little girl who heard symphonies in everyday sounds. The dripping faucet in their tiny kitchen played a steady rhythm that Amara could transform into complex melodies in her mind. The creaking floorboards above sang harmonies that only she seemed to hear. Amara was different from other children her age, though she couldn't quite understand why. While her classmates at Jefferson Elementary talked excitedly about cartoons and toys, Amara found herself drawn to the classical music that occasionally played in the background of documentaries or movies. She would freeze mid-conversation when a violin solo began, her entire being focused on absorbing every note, every subtle shift in tempo and emotion. Her most distinctive feature was her eyes, a striking ocean blue that seemed almost otherworldly against her warm brown skin inherited from her mother. These eyes held a depth that made adults uncomfortable, as if they could see straight through to truths that were meant to remain hidden. Amara had learned early that these eyes made people stare, made them whisper, made them ask questions that caused her mother's face to tighten with worry. "Where did you get those beautiful blue eyes, sweetheart?" Strangers would ask in grocery stores and at school events. Amara would look to her mother, who would quickly change the subject or hurry them away. Over time, Amara learned not to ask about her father. The few times she had tried, her mother's eyes would fill with tears, and Amara couldn't bear to cause her mama any more pain. Instead, Amara created elaborate fantasies about her father in the quiet hours before sleep. Sometimes he was a traveling musician who played in grand concert halls around the world. Other times, he was a composer writing beautiful melodies that would someday find their way to her. In her favorite daydream, he was a kind man with gentle hands and eyes like hers, who would someday return to fill the empty spaces in their small apartment with music and laughter. What Amara didn't know was that her musical intuition was extraordinary. She could identify the emotional key of any piece of music within the first few notes. She naturally understood concepts like rhythm harmony and musical phrasing that took most students years to grasp. When she hummed along to melodies, which she did constantly, she instinctively added complex harmonies that transformed simple tunes into rich, layered compositions. But the most heartbreaking thing about Amara was the question she asked herself every night before falling asleep. "Why doesn't my daddy want me?" she would whisper into her pillow, her small voice breaking with the weight of a longing she couldn't understand. She didn't know that across town, a man with her same blue eyes was asking himself a different question. What's missing from my life? Keisha Johnson had once been the most promising student in the prestigious Meridian Conservatory's piano performance program. Her professors had whispered about her potential for international acclaim, about recording contracts, and sold-out concert halls. She had possessed not just technical skill, but that rare gift of being able to make the piano sing with human emotion. That was before everything changed 8 years ago. Now, at 31, Keisha worked as the head housekeeper for Sterling Enterprises' CEO, a position that paid well enough to provide a stable life for her daughter, but required her to bury the dreams that once burned so brightly. Every morning she would dress in her crisp uniform and travel from their modest apartment to the Sterling mansion, where she would spend her days maintaining a world of luxury that felt like another planet. Keisha was a woman of quiet strength and fierce protectiveness. She had learned to make herself nearly invisible in the Sterling household, moving through rooms like a whisper, completing her tasks with meticulous care while remaining largely unnoticed by her employer. This invisibility was intentional. It was safer that way. She had been working for Alexander Sterling for 3 years, ever since his divorce was finalized, and he'd needed someone to manage his household. She had specifically chosen this job because of Alexander's reputation for being a demanding but fair employer who rarely involved himself in his staff's personal lives. She needed the steady income and excellent benefits, but more importantly, she needed to remain unnoticed. What made Keisha's situation particularly difficult was that she recognized the musical gift growing stronger in her daughter every day. Amara would unconsciously tap out complex rhythms while doing homework, would hum harmonies that showcased an understanding of musical theory she'd never been taught, and sometimes Keisha would catch her daughter standing perfectly still, head tilted, as if listening to music. Only she could hear her face transformed by pure joy. These moments filled Keisha with both pride and terror. She knew that Amara's talent was exceptional, possibly even surpassing her own natural abilities. But talent required cultivation, required lessons and instruments and opportunities that cost money. Keisha didn't have. More than that, it required exposure to a world that might lead to questions Keisha wasn't ready to answer. Late at night, after Amara was asleep, Keisha would sometimes sit at their small kitchen table and allow herself to remember. She would remember the weight of piano keys beneath her fingers, the rush of performing for audiences who hung on every note. She would remember another life, another version of herself, who had believed that love could conquer the vast differences between two worlds. But the memory that haunted her most was the day Alexander's mother had appeared at her dorm room door, with an envelope full of money and words that had shattered her young heart. "Girls like you," she had said with cold precision, "always think they can trap boys like my son. But real love means knowing when to walk away." Keisha had taken the money, not because she was greedy, but because she was terrified. Terrified that maybe Alexander's mother was right. Maybe she was just a poor girl who had gotten in over her head. Maybe the best thing she could do for the man she loved was disappear before she ruined his future. But mostly, she would look at her sleeping daughter and know that every sacrifice had been worth it. Amara was safe, happy, and loved. That was all that mattered. Even if it meant that every day Keisha had to work in the house of the man she had never stopped loving, watching him live 10 feet away from his daughter without knowing she existed. At 39, Alexander Sterling commanded a business empire worth billions, but he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt truly happy. Sterling Enterprises had grown from a small tech startup to a global corporation under his leadership, making him one of the youngest and most successful CEOs in the country. His days were filled with board meetings, international calls, and decisions that affected thousands of employees across multiple continents. Yet success had come at a price that was becoming harder to ignore with each passing year. Alexander lived alone in a mansion that could easily house 20 people, its perfectly decorated rooms echoing with the hollow sound of his solitary footsteps. His marriage to Victoria, a socialite from a prominent family, had ended 2 years ago in a divorce that was as cold and calculated as a business transaction. They had been partners in appearance, only two people who looked perfect together in photographs, but shared nothing beyond social obligations and mutual ambition. The mansion's music room had once been Alexander's sanctuary. The room housed his collection of rare and vintage pianos, including a 1925 Steinway concert grand that had once belonged to a famous European composer. Alexander had been a serious pianist in his youth, talented enough to consider a career in music before practical considerations and family expectations directed him toward business. These days, the music room stayed largely unused. Alexander would sometimes find himself standing in the doorway, looking at the instruments that had once brought him such joy, but he rarely played anymore. The music felt hollow, without someone to share it with, and he had grown tired of being alone with his thoughts in the echoing silence of the massive house. What his colleagues and competitors didn't know was that Alexander Sterling was a deeply sentimental man beneath his corporate armor. He kept photographs from his college years, hidden in his desk drawer, images of a time when he had believed that passion and love mattered more than profit margins and stock prices. Sometimes in quiet moments between meetings, he would study these photos and wonder what might have been different if he had made other choices. One photograph in particular haunted him. It showed him with a young woman whose smile had once lit up his entire world. Keisha Thompson, though he didn't know, she now went by Johnson. They had been inseparable during their senior year at university. Two people from different worlds who had found something perfect in each other's arms. Then, one day, she was gone. No explanation, no goodbye, just an empty dorm room and a broken heart that had never quite healed. He had searched for her for months, but she had disappeared as completely as if she had never existed. Eventually, he had convinced himself that their love had meant more to him than it had to her. But late at night, when the mansion felt most empty, Alexander would find himself wondering what would have happened if Keisha had stayed. Would they have built a life together? Would they have had children? Would he have learned that there were things more valuable than business success? The irony wasn't lost on him, that he had everything money could buy, but felt poorer than he had as a struggling young man with ambitious dreams and a heart full of hope. Tuesday morning started like any other for Keisha Johnson. She packed Amara's lunch, braided her daughter's hair into neat pigtails, and walked her to the bus stop before heading to work at the Sterling mansion. The autumn air was crisp, and the maple trees lining the exclusive Hillcrest neighborhood were painted in shades of gold and crimson that made the wealthy district look like something from a fairy tale. But then the phone call came that would change everything. "Mrs. Johnson." The voice belonged to Emma's mother, and she sounded apologetic. "I'm so sorry, but Emma came down with a stomach bug overnight. I don't think it's safe for Amara to come over today." Keisha's heart sank. She couldn't leave work early, not when she was still proving herself as head housekeeper. But she also couldn't leave Amara waiting at school with no one to pick her up. After a moment of panic, she made the only decision that seemed possible. She would bring Amara to work with her. It wasn't ideal, but it wouldn't be the first time. Amara was a well-behaved child who could sit quietly with her homework for a few hours. Mr. Sterling would never know they were there. He wouldn't be back until after they had left for the day. At least, that was the plan. When Keisha arrived at Jefferson Elementary, she found Amara waiting in the principal's office, looking small and worried in one of the plastic chairs that were too big for her 7-year-old frame. "I'm sorry, Mama," Amara said as soon as she saw her mother. "I didn't know Emma was sick." "It's not your fault, baby," Keisha assured her, kneeling down to give her daughter a hug that lasted a little longer than usual. Something in her heart was whispering that this day would be different, though she couldn't say why. "You're going to come to work with me today, just for a few hours until it's time to go home." Amara's eyes lit up with curiosity. She had heard her mother talk about the big house where she worked, but she had never seen it. The idea of visiting her mother's workplace felt like an adventure. The Sterling mansion never failed to take Keisha's breath away, even after 3 years of working there. As their small car wound up the circular driveway, Amara pressed her face against the window, her blue eyes wide with wonder. "Mama, is this really where you work?" she whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell. The mansion was a masterpiece of neoclassical architecture, with towering white columns and perfectly manicured gardens that looked like they belonged in a museum. Autumn flowers bloomed in precise geometric patterns, and a marble fountain featuring dancing cherubs created a gentle symphony of water music in the circular courtyard. "Yes, baby," Keisha said softly, her voice carrying years of complex emotions. "But remember what we talked about in the car. You need to stay close to me and be very quiet. This is someone's home, and we need to be respectful." Amara nodded solemnly, her artist's eye already cataloging every detail of the beautiful scene before her. She had never imagined that houses could look like castles, that gardens could be so perfectly arranged, that wealth could transform the ordinary into something magical. Inside the mansion, Amara's wonder only grew. The entrance hall soared 3 stories high with a crystal chandelier that cast rainbow prisms across walls hung with original oil paintings. The floors were polished marble that reflected everything like a mirror, and a grand staircase curved upward with a banister that looked like it was carved from a single piece of mahogany. "Stay close," Keisha whispered, pulling her cleaning cart from the service closet. "We're going to work in the music room today." As they walked through the mansion's hallways, Amara felt like she was moving through a dream. Every room they passed seemed designed to showcase beauty and luxury in ways she had never imagined possible. But it was when they entered the music room that Amara's world truly shifted on its axis. The music room was a shrine to the art form that had always called to her soul. The walls were lined with instruments from around the world, violins in glass cases, a collection of antique flutes, even a small harp that gleamed gold in the afternoon sunlight. But dominating the center of the room was the most magnificent piano Amara had ever seen. The Steinway Concert Grand sat like a sleeping giant, its ebony surface polished to a mirror shine. The bench was upholstered in deep burgundy velvet, and music stands held sheets of handwritten compositions that looked ancient and precious. Even in silence, the piano seemed to radiate a musical presence that made Amara's heart race with longing. "Wow," she breathed, forgetting her promise to stay quiet. "Amara, come here," Keisha called from across the room, her voice carrying a note of gentle warning. "Sit at this table and work on your homework. And remember, don't touch anything." But as Amara obediently opened her math workbook, she found it impossible to concentrate on addition and subtraction problems. The piano called to her with a force that felt almost gravitational. She could imagine how the keys would feel beneath her fingers, could almost hear the music that was waiting to be released from the instrument's depths. The pull was so strong that it felt like the piano was speaking to her, calling her name in a language only she could understand. Without fully realizing what she was doing, Amara found herself standing and moving toward the piano. Her homework lay forgotten on the table as she approached the magnificent instrument with the reverence of a pilgrim approaching a shrine. Amara stood before the Steinway, her small hands clasped behind her back as she stared at the keys. She had promised her mother not to touch anything, and she was a child who took promises seriously. But the pull of the music was stronger than anything she had ever experienced. She could see the music in her mind, not just random notes, but complete melodies with harmonies and rhythms that seemed to flow from some deep well of understanding she didn't know she possessed. Her fingers twitched at her sides as her brain automatically assigned each note to its corresponding key. "Just one note," she whispered to herself, "just to see what it sounds like." Glancing over at her mother, who was busy dusting a bookshelf on the far side of the room, Amara gently pressed middle C. The note rang out pure and clear, hanging in the air like a perfect crystal sphere. The sound was more beautiful than any note she had ever heard, richer and more complex than the old upright piano at school, with harmonics that seemed to bloom and fade like flowers. Before she could stop herself, Amara pressed another key, then another. Her right hand found the beginning of a melody that had been playing in her dreams for as long as she could remember. Her left hand, acting on pure instinct, began adding a simple harmonic accompaniment. Within moments, she was playing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece she had never studied, never seen the sheet music for, but had absorbed somehow through the mysterious musical intuition that governed her young mind. The music flowed from her fingers as naturally as breathing. Each phrase was perfectly shaped, each dynamic change occurring with the natural ebb and flow of musical logic. She wasn't just playing the notes, she was telling a story, painting emotions in sound with the skill of someone who had been studying piano for decades. The melody seemed to carry all the longing in her 7-year-old heart, all the questions about her father that she was afraid to ask, all the love she felt for her mother, and the mysterious sadness she sometimes saw in her mama's eyes. Keisha dropped her dusting cloth and spun around, her heart stopping as she realized what was happening. Her daughter, her precious, talented daughter, was playing Alexander Sterling's piano with a skill that defied explanation. But more than that, she was playing it with the same emotional depth that Keisha remembered from her own conservatory days. "Amara!" Keisha called out, her voice sharp with panic. "Stop! Come here right now!" But Amara was lost in the music, her entire being focused on the conversation she was having with the piano. The instrument responded to her touch, like a living thing, each key press creating sounds that seemed to pour directly from her heart. It was at this moment that Alexander Sterling, returning early from a canceled meeting, walked into his music room and discovered that his carefully ordered world was about to explode into a million pieces. Alexander had heard the music from the moment he entered his house through the service entrance. At first, he assumed Keisha had left a classical music station playing, though he couldn't remember her ever showing interest in Chopin before. But as he moved closer to the music room, he realized that what he was hearing wasn't a recording. Someone was playing his piano. More than that, someone was playing his piano with a level of technical skill and emotional maturity that he had rarely encountered, even in professional concert settings. The interpretation of the Nocturne was breathtaking, not just note perfect, but infused with a deep understanding of the music's emotional landscape that transformed the familiar piece into something transcendent. Alexander approached the music room with the caution of someone approaching a miracle. When he reached the doorway and saw the source of the extraordinary music, his breath caught in his throat. A small girl, she couldn't be more than 7 or 8 years old, sat at his piano bench, her tiny hands moving across the keys with impossible grace and precision. Her posture was perfect, her technique flawless, her musical phrasing sophisticated beyond anything that should have been possible for someone her age. But it wasn't just her playing that stopped Alexander cold. It was her face. As the final notes of the Nocturne faded into silence, the little girl turned toward him with a shy smile, and Alexander found himself looking into eyes that were the exact shade of ocean blue as his own. The shape of her face, the curve of her smile, even the way she tilted her head, Everything about her struck him with a familiarity that made his heart pound. "I'm sorry," the girl said quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I wasn't supposed to touch the piano, but the music was so beautiful in my head, and I just wanted to hear what it would sound like." Across the room, Keisha stood frozen, her face pale with terror. She looked like someone who had just watched her worst nightmare come to life. "Amara, come here right now," Keisha said, her voice tight with controlled panic. "Mr. Sterling, I'm so sorry. She knows better than this. It won't happen again." But Alexander barely heard Keisha's apologies. He was studying the little girl's face, his mind racing through possibilities that seemed too incredible to believe. The eyes, the musical talent, the age. Everything was falling into place like pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving. "What's your name?" he asked gently, kneeling down so he was at eye level with the child. "Amara," she said softly. "Amara Johnson. Are you mad at me for playing your piano?" "Mad?" Alexander shook his head slowly, his voice thick with emotion he was struggling to control. "No, Amara. I'm not mad. I'm amazed. Where did you learn to play like that?" Amara looked confused by the question. "I don't know. I hear the music in my head, and my fingers know where to go. It's like the piano is talking to me." Alexander felt the world shift around him. This wasn't possible. Children didn't just naturally play Chopin with professional-level technique. They especially didn't do it while looking at him with eyes that mirrored his own so perfectly. It was like staring into a genetic time machine. But as he knelt there, looking into this extraordinary child's face, another impossible thought began to form. The timing, the eyes, the musical talent that seemed to run in his family, and most of all, the way Keisha was standing frozen across the room, like someone whose deepest secret had just been exposed. "Would you like to play something else?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled, despite the chaos of emotions raging inside him. Amara's face lit up with joy. "Really? You don't mind?" "I don't mind at all. In fact, I think I'd like to hear more of your music." As Amara turned back to the piano and began playing Mozart's Sonata in C major, Alexander's eyes met Keisha's across the room. The terror in her expression, the way she was clutching her dusting cloth like a lifeline, the years of carefully maintained distance between them, it all suddenly made terrible perfect sense. This extraordinary little girl with his eyes and impossible musical talent wasn't just Keisha's daughter. She was his daughter too. But what Alexander didn't know was that across the room, Keisha was remembering a conversation from 8 years ago when a stern woman with cold eyes had handed her an envelope full of money and said, "If you really love my son, you'll disappear before you ruin his life." And what Keisha didn't know was that Alexander had never stopped looking for her, had never stopped wondering what had happened to the love of his life, who had vanished without explanation. And what neither of them knew was that their daughter, the miracle child who had just brought them back together through the power of music, was about to ask a question that would force them to confront the truth they had both been hiding for so long. As the last notes of Mozart faded into silence, Amara turned to face the two adults, who were staring at each other with the intensity of people seeing ghosts. "Mr. Sterling," she said in her clear, innocent voice, "do you know my daddy? Because Mama gets really sad whenever I ask about him, and sometimes I think maybe he's lost and just needs someone to help him find us." The silence that followed was so complete that even the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to hold its breath. And in that silence, 8 years of secrets, pain, and misunderstanding finally began to crack open, like ice breaking apart to let the spring water flow. The conversation that followed Amara's impromptu concert was stilted, and awkward, filled with the weight of unspoken truths and carefully avoided revelations. Alexander struggled to maintain his composure as he watched this remarkable child demonstrate musical abilities that shouldn't have existed in someone her age. Keisha stood rigid with terror, calculating how quickly she could collect her daughter and disappear before questions became unavoidable. But neither adult could ignore what had just happened. This wasn't a coincidence or a case of mistaken identity. This was destiny, knocking down their carefully constructed walls with a 7-year-old's perfect performance of Chopin. "Amara," Alexander said carefully, his voice gentle, but his hands trembling slightly. "Would you like to come back tomorrow? I could teach you more music." The little girl's face transformed with pure joy, like someone had just told her Christmas was coming early. "Really? You would do that? You would teach me to play even better?" "If your mother agrees." Alexander said, his eyes meeting Keisha's with an intensity that made her step backward. Keisha's mind raced through options and consequences. Refusing would seem suspicious and ungrateful. Agreeing meant regular contact between Alexander and Amara, which carried risks she had spent 7 years carefully avoiding. But the hope shining in her daughter's eyes, the pure longing for music that Keisha recognized, because she had felt it herself, made the decision for her. "If Mr. Sterling has the time," Keisha said quietly, her voice barely steady, "and if it doesn't interfere with his work." "I'll make time," Alexander replied, and there was something in his voice that suggested he would move mountains to make it happen. "Every day, if Amara wants to learn." That evening, as they walked to their car, Amara chatted excitedly about the piano, about the beautiful music room, about the kind man who had listened to her play without getting angry. Keisha listened with half her attention, while the other half spiraled through panic scenarios and escape plans. But as they drove home through the gathering dusk, something unexpected happened. Watching her daughter's animated face in the rearview mirror, seeing joy she had never witnessed before, Keisha felt a small spark of something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Maybe this could work. Maybe she could find a way to give Amara the musical education she deserved without destroying the life they had built together. Maybe Alexander Sterling was the answer to prayers she had been afraid to voice. Or maybe this was the beginning of the end of everything. But that night, as Amara fell asleep humming, Chopin Keisha made a decision that would change all their lives. She would let her daughter have this chance, even if it meant facing the man she had never stopped loving, and the truth she had spent 8 years running from. And across town, in a mansion that suddenly felt less empty, Alexander Sterling sat at his piano and played the same nocturne that had started it all. His fingers finding new meaning in every note as he thought about tomorrow's lesson with a little girl who had his eyes and his musical soul. Neither of them knew that by agreeing to these piano lessons, they had just set in motion a chain of events that would heal old wounds, reveal long-buried secrets, and prove that some connections are too powerful to remain hidden forever. The next afternoon, Amara could barely contain her excitement as she and her mother returned to the Sterling mansion. She had thought about the piano all night, dreaming of melodies and harmonies that she wanted to try. During school, she had found it almost impossible to concentrate on her lessons, her mind constantly returning to the feel of the piano keys beneath her fingers and the kind man who had promised to teach her more. But as they approached the mansion's grand entrance, Amara noticed something different about her mother. Keisha seemed nervous more so than usual, checking her appearance in the car mirror and taking deep breaths like she was preparing for something difficult. "Mama, are you okay?" Amara asked as they walked up the marble steps. "I'm fine, baby," Keisha replied, but her voice was tight. "Just remember what we talked about. Be polite, listen carefully, and don't touch anything except the piano." Alexander was waiting for them in the music room, and Keisha noticed immediately that he had changed too. Gone was the distant professional demeanor she had grown accustomed to over 3 years of employment. In its place was something warmer and more focused, the attention of someone who had discovered something precious and rare. "Good afternoon, Amara," Alexander said, his voice gentle, but carrying an undertone of barely contained excitement. "Are you ready for your first real piano lesson?" "Yes, sir," Amara replied, practically bouncing with enthusiasm. What followed was unlike any piano lesson that had ever been conducted in that room. Alexander quickly realized that traditional teaching methods were inadequate for a student like Amara. She absorbed musical concepts with the speed of someone downloading information directly into her brain. When he explained scales, she immediately understood not just the finger patterns, but the mathematical relationships between notes. When he demonstrated dynamics, she intuitively grasped how volume and expression could transform the emotional content of a piece. "Listen to this," Alexander said, playing a simple melody in C major. "Now listen to the same melody in C minor." The shift from major to minor was subtle but profound, changing the entire emotional character of the music. Amara's eyes widened with understanding. "It's like the music is happy in the first one and sad in the second one, but it's the same tune." "Exactly. Music can tell different stories depending on how you play it. The notes are like words, and you're the storyteller." This concept seemed to unlock something in Amara's understanding. She began experimenting with the pieces Alexander showed her, not just playing them as written, but exploring how small changes in tempo dynamics and phrasing could completely alter their emotional impact. More remarkably, Amara seemed to understand music on a compositional level that typically took students years to develop. When Alexander played the beginning of a Bach invention, she could predict where the harmony was heading. When he started a Mozart sonata, she began adding appropriate ornamentations that enhanced rather than distracted from the original melody. "This is impossible," Alexander murmured, after Amara flawlessly played a Clementi sonatina that should have taken months to master. "You've really never had formal lessons." "No, sir," Amara said, then paused thoughtfully. "But sometimes I dream about music. In my dreams there's a man who teaches me things, and when I wake up I remember what he showed me." Alexander's breath caught, and across the room Keisha froze in the middle of dusting a bookshelf. "What does this man in your dreams look like?" Alexander asked, his voice carefully controlled. "He has kind eyes," Amara said, studying Alexander's face with the intense concentration of a child trying to solve a puzzle. "And he smiles a lot when we play music together. He looks—" She paused, tilting her head in exactly the same way Alexander did when he was thinking, "He looks kind of like you." The silence that followed was deafening. Keisha slowly set down her dusting cloth, her hands shaking. Alexander stared at this extraordinary child, who seemed to carry pieces of him in ways that went beyond coincidence. "Do you think," Amara continued with the fearless curiosity of childhood, "that maybe my daddy is somewhere nearby? Maybe that's why I dream about someone who looks like you teaching me piano." It was Keisha who broke the spell, clearing her throat and stepping forward. "Amara, sweetie, we should let Mr. Sterling get back to his work. You've had a long lesson." But Alexander wasn't ready for them to leave. Not when every instinct he possessed was screaming that this child was his, that this impossible coincidence was actually fate correcting a terrible mistake. "Actually," he said, his voice steady, despite the emotional earthquake occurring inside him, "I was hoping we could make this a daily arrangement. If that's all right with you, Mrs. Johnson." The formal use of her married name, a name she had adopted to create distance from her past, felt like a small stab to Keisha's heart. But she nodded, because saying no would require explanations she wasn't prepared to give. "If you're certain it's not too much trouble." "It's no trouble at all," Alexander replied, his eyes never leaving Amara's face. In fact, I think Amara and I are going to learn quite a lot from each other. As the days turned into weeks, the daily piano lessons became the highlight of Alexander's carefully structured life. He found himself leaving important meetings early, rescheduling conference calls, and delegating responsibilities he had never trusted to anyone else, all so he could spend an hour each afternoon watching his daughter's extraordinary talent unfold, because by now he was certain that Amara was his daughter. The evidence was overwhelming. The physical resemblance, the musical gift that matched his own family's genetic predisposition, and the timing that aligned perfectly with his relationship with Keisha 8 years ago. More than the logical evidence, though, was the emotional certainty that grew stronger each day. When Amara played, Alexander felt something he had never experienced before, a deep primal recognition that seemed to vibrate in his bones. This was his child, his flesh and blood, his genetic and artistic legacy made manifest in 7-year-old hands that could coax miracles from piano keys. "Tell me about Chopin," Amara said one afternoon, settling into the velvet bench like a small queen claiming her throne. Alexander found himself launching into passionate explanations about Romantic-era composition, about how Chopin revolutionized piano technique, about the emotional depth that made his music immortal. And Amara would listen with complete attention, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated understanding far beyond her years. "Did Chopin have a little girl who played piano?" she asked one afternoon. "No," Alexander replied carefully. "But if he had, I think he would have written beautiful music just for her. Like you could write music for me." The innocent question hit Alexander with unexpected force. "Would you like that? Would you like me to write music just for you?" Amara's smile was radiant. "That would be the most wonderful thing in the whole world, better than Christmas and my birthday together." That evening, for the first time in 2 years, Alexander sat down at his home piano and began to compose. The melody that flowed from his fingers was unlike anything he had ever written, tender and playful, complex enough to challenge Amara's growing skills, but infused with the kind of love that could only come from a father's heart. He titled it Amara's Song, and when he played it for her the next day, she burst into tears. "It's so beautiful," she whispered, her small hands pressed to her heart. "It sounds like love." "That's because it is love," Alexander said without thinking. "It's how much I care about you." The words hung in the air between them, more revealing than Alexander had intended. Amara looked up at him with those devastating blue eyes, and for a moment, he saw recognition flicker across her face. "Mr. Alexander," she said quietly, "do you think it's possible to love someone you just met? Or does love take a long time to grow?" "I think," Alexander said carefully, "that sometimes your heart knows things before your mind does. Sometimes love happens instantly, like recognizing something you've been searching for your whole life." Amara nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to her 7-year-old understanding of the world. "That's how I felt when I first saw your piano, like I had been looking for it forever." While Alexander and Amara were building their musical bond, Keisha was slowly coming apart. Every day brought new evidence of the connection forming between her employer and her daughter, and every day made it harder to maintain the fiction that Amara was just the housekeeper's child who happened to be musically gifted. Alexander's behavior had changed completely. Where once he had barely acknowledged her presence, now he sought her out for conversations about Amara's progress, about her school performance, about her general health and happiness. His questions were probing but carefully worded, as if he was gathering information without quite admitting why he needed it. Amara mentioned that she sometimes has trouble sleeping, he said one afternoon, appearing in the kitchen where Keisha was organizing supplies. "Has she always been a restless sleeper?" "Since she was very young," Keisha replied cautiously. The doctor says it's normal for children with active imaginations. And her father? Alexander asked, his voice carefully neutral, but his eyes intense. Does she ask about him often? Keisha's hands stilled on the inventory clipboard. This was the question she had been dreading, the one that could unravel everything. Sometimes. I tell her that her father is a good man who loves her very much, but can't be with us right now. That must be difficult for her. And for you. The kindness in his voice was almost more than Keisha could bear. This was the man she had fallen in love with 8 years ago. Thoughtful, gentle, genuinely caring about the well-being of others. But it was also the man whose world she had fled because she couldn't bear the thought of being seen as someone who had trapped him with an unplanned pregnancy. We manage, she said quietly, but her voice betrayed the strain she was under. Keisha, Alexander said, and something in his tone made her look up. When their eyes met, she saw not just curiosity, but something deeper, something that looked suspiciously like recognition. If there's ever anything you need, anything at all, I hope you know you can ask. Amara is very special, and I want to make sure she has every opportunity to develop her gifts. The sincerity in his eyes made her want to confess everything, to fall into his arms, and let him take care of all the burdens she had been carrying alone. But fear was stronger than longing. Thank you, Mr. Sterling. That's very kind. But that night, as Keisha lay awake, listening to Amara practice piano pieces on the kitchen table with her fingers, she knew that their carefully balanced life was approaching a tipping point. Soon she would have to make a choice between protecting her secrets and giving her daughter the father she deserved. And deep in her heart, she was beginning to suspect that Alexander already knew the truth. The way he looked at Amara, the way he spoke about her, the careful questions about her father, it all suggested that he was putting together the same puzzle that had been haunting Keisha for years. The question was no longer whether the truth would come out, but when, and whether she would be brave enough to tell it herself before circumstances forced her hand. 3 weeks into their daily lessons, something extraordinary happened that would change the trajectory of all their lives. Alexander had been working with Amara on a challenging piece by Rachmaninoff, far too advanced for any normal 7-year-old, but perfectly suited to her unusual combination of technical skill and emotional maturity. The key to this passage, Alexander explained, demonstrating with his own hands, is understanding that Rachmaninoff was writing about homesickness. He was far from Russia when he composed this, and you can hear his longing for home in every note. Amara nodded thoughtfully, then placed her hands on the keys. What emerged was not just a performance of the piece, but a transformation of it. She played with a depth of feeling that seemed to channel not just Rachmaninoff's homesickness, but her own 7-year-old yearning for something she couldn't quite name. The music spoke of loss and longing, of searching for something that felt just out of reach. Every note carried the weight of questions unasked and needs unspoken. It was the sound of a child's heart calling out for what was missing from her life. As the final notes faded away, Alexander found himself with tears in his eyes. Amara, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. It made me think about my daddy, she said simply, her small hands still resting on the keys. Sometimes I feel homesick for someone I've never met. Do you think that's possible? The innocence of her statement broke Alexander's heart and his resolve simultaneously. He knelt down beside the piano bench and looked into eyes that were unmistakably his own. What if I told you, he said carefully, his voice barely above a whisper, that sometimes daddies feel homesick for their little girls too, even when they don't know where those little girls are. Amara studied his face with the intense concentration of someone trying to solve the most important puzzle of her life. Do you think my daddy might be looking for me? Do you think maybe he's closer than I thought? I think, Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion he could no longer hide, that if your daddy knew where you were, he would never want to be anywhere else. Across the room, Keisha stood frozen, watching the two most important people in her life circle around a truth that would change everything once it was spoken aloud. She could see the recognition dawning in both their faces, could feel the weight of 8 years of secrets pressing down on her like a physical force. And in that moment, she realized that no matter how much she wanted to protect them both from the complications that truth would bring, she could no longer deny what was becoming obvious to everyone in the room. The time for hiding was over. But what none of them expected was that the revelation would come not from careful adult conversation, but from the devastating honesty of a child who had spent her entire life wondering why she felt incomplete. "Mr. Alexander," Amara said, her voice carrying a strange certainty that seemed far beyond her years. "I think you might be my daddy, because when I play music with you, I don't feel homesick anymore. I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of Keisha's sharp intake of breath and the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. And in that silence, 3 hearts that had been searching for each other across years of separation and misunderstanding finally began to beat in rhythm, like music finding its way home. The inevitable conversation came on a gray Thursday afternoon in November, when the autumn light filtering through the mansion's tall windows seemed to reflect the somber mood that had been building for days. Alexander had been watching Keisha closely, noting the increasing tension in her shoulders, the way she avoided making eye contact, the manner in which she seemed to be preparing for something. He found her in the music room, after Amara's lesson, methodically cleaning the same piano keys over and over again, her movements betraying the anxiety she was trying to hide. "Keisha," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. "We need to talk." She didn't look up from the piano keys, but her hands stilled. "About what?" "About the fact that I know Amara is my daughter." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge that once crossed would change everything forever. Keisha's shoulders sagged, and she finally turned to face the man who held her fate in his hands. "I know," she said simply, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you?" Alexander stepped closer, his voice controlled, but underneath the calm surface was a volcano of emotions threatening to erupt. "Because I'm not sure you understand what I've figured out. I know that you disappeared 8 years ago without telling me you were pregnant. I know that you've been working in my house for 3 years, watching me live 10 feet away from my child without having any idea she existed." Keisha lifted her chin with a dignity that reminded Alexander of exactly why he had fallen in love with her all those years ago. "You don't know anything about why I left." "Then tell me." Alexander's voice cracked slightly, revealing the pain he'd been carrying for 8 years. "Tell me why you thought it was acceptable to keep my daughter's existence a secret. Tell me why you let me live as half a person when the other half of my soul was right here in my house, growing up without me." "Because I was protecting her." The words burst out of Keisha with 8 years of accumulated pain behind them. "Because I was 23 years old and pregnant, and everyone would have said I was trying to trap the rich boy. Because your family would have destroyed us both to protect their precious reputation." "You don't know what my family would have done, because you never gave them the chance to prove you wrong." "Don't I?" Keisha's eyes blazed with anger and hurt that had been buried for too long. "Your mother made it very clear what she thought of girls like me when she came to see me after I missed my period." Alexander went very still, his face draining of color. "What did you say?" Your mother knew about us, Alexander. She knew about the pregnancy before I even had a chance to tell you myself. She came to my dorm room with an envelope full of money and a very clear message about what was expected of girls who knew their place. The blood drained from Alexander's face completely. My mother came to see you. She offered me $50,000 to disappear and never contact you again. She said that if I truly cared about you, I wouldn't destroy your future by saddling you with responsibilities you weren't ready for. Keisha's voice broke slightly, the old wounds still raw after all these years. She said that someone like me could never fit into your world, and trying would only hurt everyone involved, especially our baby. Alexander sank into a chair, the revelation hitting him like a physical blow. All these years he had believed that Keisha had simply decided their relationship wasn't worth continuing. He had convinced himself that her sudden disappearance was proof that what they had shared hadn't been as meaningful to her as it was to him. "And you believed her?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "I was scared, and alone, and pregnant," Keisha said fiercely, tears starting to flow. "I was a scholarship student who cleaned offices to pay for textbooks, and she was offering me more money than my mother made in 3 years. But that's not why I took it." "Then why?" "Because when she described the life you were destined for, the society parties, the business empire, the wife who would be an asset to your career, I realized she was right about one thing. I loved you too much to hold you back from everything you were meant to become." The room fell silent, except for the sound of both their ragged breathing. Alexander stared at his hands, processing the magnitude of what had been stolen from him from all of them. "You should have told me," he said finally, his voice thick with grief for all the lost years. "You should have given me the choice." "And what would you have chosen?" Keisha asked quietly, her voice challenging but vulnerable. "Really honestly, what would 20-year-old Alexander Sterling have done if I had shown up pregnant and needy, asking you to give up your entire planned future?" Alexander wanted to say that he would have chosen her and their baby without hesitation. But the honest answer was more complicated, and they both knew it. He had been young, ambitious, still trying to prove himself to a father who had never thought he was good enough, and a mother who had never shown him unconditional love. "I would have chosen you," he said finally, and meant it. "Maybe not perfectly, maybe not without making mistakes, but I would have chosen you. Because what we had was real, Keisha. It was the most real thing in my life." "But your mother said—" "My mother was wrong," Alexander said fiercely, standing up and moving toward her. "She was wrong about you, wrong about us, and wrong about what would make me happy. I've spent 8 years living exactly the life she planned for me, and I've been miserable every single day." The pain in his voice broke through Keisha's defenses. She could see the man she had fallen in love with, could see the hurt and confusion of someone who had been betrayed by the people who were supposed to love him most. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting all of us. And instead, you condemned us all to 8 years of loneliness and regret." The harsh words hung between them, and for a moment Keisha thought he might never forgive her. But then Alexander's expression softened, and she saw not anger, but grief in his eyes. "But you gave me Amara," he said quietly. "You raised her to be extraordinary, kind, talented, everything I could have hoped for in a daughter. And you brought her back to me, even if you didn't mean to." "She's so much like you," Keisha said, tears flowing freely now. "Not just the music, but the way she thinks, the way she sees the world. Every day I saw pieces of you in her, and every day I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake." "We both made mistakes," Alexander said, moving closer. "But we can't change the past. What we can do is decide what happens next. What do you want to happen next?" Alexander looked at this woman, who had given him the greatest gift of his life, and then disappeared with it, and realized that despite everything, despite the pain and the lost years and the secrets, he had never stopped loving her. "I want to be Amara's father," he said simply. "Not just her piano teacher, not just some family friend. I want legal recognition, shared custody, and the right to make decisions about her education and welfare. But more than that, I want to be part of a family again. The family we should have been all along." Keisha searched his face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. What she saw instead was sincerity, hope, and something that looked like the love she remembered from their college days. "And us?" she asked quietly. "What about us?" Alexander stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes, close enough to remember what it felt like to be loved by him. "I think," he said carefully, "that we owe it to ourselves and to Amara to find out if we can rebuild what we lost. But slowly, carefully, with honesty this time, instead of secrets." Before Keisha could respond, they heard the sound of the front door opening and closing, followed by familiar footsteps running toward the music room. "Mama! Mr. Alexander!" Amara's voice called out happily. "I learned a new song at school today, and I want to play it for you." As their daughter burst into the room, her face bright with excitement and innocent joy, both adults realized that whatever happened between them, they had already been given a second chance at the thing that mattered most, the chance to be a family. That night, Alexander sat alone in his study, with a glass of whiskey he wasn't drinking, and a storm of emotions he couldn't control. The conversation with Keisha had unearthed feelings and memories he had spent years trying to bury. For 8 years, he had believed that she had simply decided their relationship wasn't worth continuing. Now, he knew the truth. She had loved him enough to sacrifice her own happiness for what she believed was his future welfare. The complexity of his emotions was overwhelming. Anger at his mother for her manipulative interference, rage at the circumstances that had robbed him of 8 years of his daughter's life, grief for all the moments he had missed the bedtime stories, unread the scraped knees uncomforted, the piano lessons ungiven. But underneath all of these emotions was something else, a bone-deep recognition that Amara was his daughter, and nothing else mattered as much as that fact. He picked up his phone to call his mother, then set it down without dialing. That confrontation would have to wait. Right now, he needed to figure out how to build a relationship with his daughter without destroying the only stable life she had ever known. Meanwhile, across town in their small apartment, Keisha was having her own emotional reckoning. Amara was asleep finally after an evening of excited chatter about her piano lesson and the beautiful song Mr. Alexander had written just for her. "Mama," she had said as Keisha tucked her into bed, "why did you look so sad when I came home today? Did something bad happen?" "No, baby," Keisha had replied, smoothing her daughter's hair. "Sometimes grown-ups just have big feelings about important things. Like love feelings." The question had caught Keisha off guard. "What do you mean?" "Like when you really love someone, but you're scared to tell them. Emma's mom explained it to me when we watched a movie about it." Out of the mouths of babes. "Yes, sweetie. Sometimes love feelings can be scary because they're so big and important. Do you think Mr. Alexander has love feelings that are too big and scary to talk about?" Keisha had paused, struck by her daughter's intuitive understanding of the emotional undercurrents she was picking up on. "Why do you ask that?" "Because he looks at you the way Daddy looks at Mommy in the movies, and he looks at me like I make him happy and sad at the same time." Now, sitting alone in her kitchen with a cup of tea growing cold, Keisha marveled at her daughter's emotional intelligence. Amara was seeing things that the adults were trying to hide, understanding connections that they were afraid to acknowledge. But more than that, Amara seemed to instinctively grasp that the three of them belonged together, that the family she had always dreamed of was within reach, if the adults could just find the courage to claim it. The question was whether Keisha was brave enough to trust in the possibility of happiness after 8 years of protecting herself from potential heartbreak. 2 days later, the fragile peace they had established was shattered by an unexpected crisis. Keisha arrived at work to find Alexander pacing in his study, his face grim and his usual composure completely gone. "What's wrong?" she asked, immediately sensing that something was seriously amiss. "My mother," Alexander said without preamble. "She knows about Amara." Keisha felt the blood drain from her face. "How? Someone at the charity gala we attended last week recognized you mentioned it to her. She's demanding to meet her granddaughter, and she's threatening legal action if I don't arrange it immediately." The idea of Eleanor Sterling anywhere near her daughter filled Keisha with terror. This was the woman who had destroyed her young dreams with cold calculation, who had made it clear that Keisha would never be good enough for her son or their family. "She can't," Keisha said, her voice rising with panic. "She gave up any rights to Amara when she paid me to disappear. That's not how she sees it. She claims she was protecting the family from scandal, and now that the truth is out, she wants to be involved in Amara's life. Over my dead body." Alexander stopped pacing and looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Keisha, she's threatening to sue for grandparents' rights. She has lawyers' money influence. If this goes to court, she'll drag out every detail of our past, including the circumstances of Amara's birth, and your decision to take the money." The implications hit Keisha like a physical blow. A court battle would expose everything, would put Amara in the middle of a legal war between adults who claim to love her. It would also raise questions about Keisha's fitness as a parent, questions that a woman with Eleanor Sterling's resources could manipulate to her advantage. "What do you want me to do?" she asked quietly. "I want you to trust me," Alexander said, moving closer. "Let me handle my mother. Let me arrange a meeting on our terms, in our space, with both of us present. If we control the situation, if we present a united front, we can limit her ability to cause damage. And if she tries to take Amara away from me, she won't succeed," Alexander said firmly. "I won't let her. Amara belongs with you, with us. No court in the world would award custody to a grandmother over fit parents who are working together." The word parents hung in the air between them, a promise and a declaration rolled into one. "Are we?" Keisha asked quietly. "Working together?" "Yes," Alexander said without hesitation. "Whatever our personal issues, whatever we still need to figure out between us, we're united when it comes to Amara. Her welfare comes first always." That afternoon they sat Amara down for what they hoped would be a gentle introduction to the concept that she had more family than she knew about. "Sweetheart," Alexander began carefully, "how would you feel about meeting someone new? Someone who's related to both of us?" Amara looked back and forth between her parents with the serious expression she wore when trying to solve complex problems. "Like an aunt or uncle? Like a grandmother?" Keisha said, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. "Mr. Alexander's mother would like to meet you." "Do I have to call her Grandma?" Amara asked, and there was something in her tone that suggested she had already picked up on the tension surrounding this topic. "You can call her whatever feels comfortable," Alexander said. "The important thing is that Mama and I will be right there with you the whole time. This is just a meeting, just a chance for her to see how wonderful you are." "Will she like me?" The question was asked with the vulnerability of a child who had learned that adult approval was never guaranteed. "She's going to love you," Alexander said with complete conviction. "How could she not? You're perfect." But even as he spoke the words, Alexander was praying that his mother would prove him right. Because if Eleanor Sterling tried to hurt his daughter in any way, he would have to choose between his family of origin and the family he was trying to build. And that choice, he was beginning to realize, had already been made. The meeting was arranged for the following Sunday afternoon in the mansion's formal living room, rather than the intimate music room where Amara felt most comfortable. Alexander wanted his mother to see Amara in the context of wealth and privilege, to understand that this child belonged in their world as much as any of them did. Eleanor Sterling arrived precisely on time, dressed in an elegant suit that probably cost more than Keisha Maid in a month. She was a handsome woman in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a perfect chignon, and the kind of bone structure that spoke of generations of good breeding. But it was her eyes that made Keisha's stomach clench with remembered fear, the same cold blue that had looked at her with such disdain 8 years ago. "Mother," Alexander said, formally rising to greet her. "Thank you for coming." "Alexander," she replied, her gaze immediately seeking out and finding Amara, who was sitting between her parents on the large sofa. For a moment, Eleanor's composed mask slipped, and Keisha saw genuine shock and something that might have been recognition flash across her features. "You must be Amara," Eleanor said, her voice softer than Keisha had expected. "I'm Mrs. Sterling, your father's mother." "Hello," Amara said politely, but she didn't move from her position between her parents. "Are you really my grandmother?" "I am, indeed," Eleanor replied, settling into the chair across from them. "And I must say, you look remarkably like your father did at your age." It was true. Now that they were all in the same room, the family resemblance was unmistakable. Amara had Alexander's eyes, his facial structure, even some of his mannerisms. She was clearly a Sterling, regardless of what name she carried. "Can I show you something?" Amara asked suddenly, apparently deciding that this formal conversation needed a different approach. "Of course, dear." Amara got up and moved to the piano that sat in the corner of the living room. It was smaller than the grand piano in the music room, but perfectly tuned and well-maintained. Without any preamble, she began to play the piece Alexander had composed for her, Amara's song. The effect on Eleanor was immediate and profound. Her carefully maintained composure cracked completely as she listened to her granddaughter play with skill and emotion that seemed impossible in someone so young. By the time the last notes faded away, there were tears streaming down the older woman's cheeks. "That was," Eleanor began, then stopped, her voice thick with emotion. "That was extraordinary. Daddy wrote it for me," Amara said, simply returning to her place between her parents. "He says music is how we tell people we love them when words aren't big enough." Eleanor's eyes met Alexander's across the room, and in that moment, she saw not the rebellious young man she had tried to control, but a father who adored his child and had found a way to express that love through the gift they shared. "I owe you all an apology," Eleanor said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Especially you, Keisha. I was wrong 8 years ago. I was so focused on protecting Alexander from what I thought would be a mistake that I never considered that I might be destroying something beautiful." Keisha felt her chest tighten with emotion she hadn't expected. "Mrs. Sterling, Please," Eleanor interrupted. "Let me finish. I've spent 8 years watching my son become successful, but never happy, never fulfilled in the way that matters most. And now I see why. You didn't take away his future, I did. I took away his family." The admission hung in the air, heavy with years of regret and misunderstanding. "Grandma Eleanor," Amara said suddenly, apparently having decided that formal names were too much work. "Are you sad because you missed my growing up?" Eleanor looked at this extraordinary child who seemed wise beyond her years and nodded. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm very sad about that." "Well," Amara said, with the practical problem-solving attitude she had inherited from both her parents, "you can't have the growing up that already happened, but you can have the growing up that's going to happen next, if you want to." The simple wisdom of her statement broke through the last of Eleanor's defenses. "I would like that very much," she said, her voice thick with tears. "If your parents think that would be all right." Alexander and Keisha exchanged a look over their daughter's head, a conversation held entirely in glances. They had both been hurt by this woman. Both suffered because of her interference, but they also both understood that Amara deserved to know her grandmother, and that Eleanor's genuine remorse was the first step toward healing old wounds. "We think that would be fine," Alexander said finally. "As long as everyone understands that Keisha and I make the decisions about Amara's welfare. We're her parents, and we're committed to raising her together." "Together?" Eleanor asked, and there was hope in her voice. "Together." Keisha confirmed, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "We're a family, even if we're still figuring out exactly what that looks like." As they continued to talk, making tentative plans for future visits, and establishing boundaries that would protect Amara while allowing Eleanor to build a relationship with her granddaughter Keisha, found herself thinking about second chances and the power of forgiveness. This woman had nearly destroyed her life 8 years ago, but she was also Amara's grandmother and Alexander's mother. If they were going to be a family, really be a family, then Eleanor would have to be part of that equation. It wouldn't be easy. Trust would have to be earned gradually, and there would undoubtedly be conflicts and misunderstandings along the way. But watching Eleanor's face as she listened to Amara chatter about school and music and her dreams for the future, Keisha saw something she hadn't expected. She saw love. Genuine, overwhelming grandmotherly love that had nothing to do with social position or family reputation, and everything to do with the extraordinary little girl who had just played piano like an angel and offered forgiveness with the casual grace of childhood. Maybe Keisha thought this was how healing happened, not through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but through small acts of courage and the willingness to believe that people could change. Maybe they all deserved a second chance. The weeks that followed Eleanor's introduction to Amara were a careful dance of boundary setting and relationship building. True to her word, Eleanor approached her new role as grandmother with humility and respect for the parenting decisions Alexander and Keisha made together. She started small, sending age-appropriate books and educational toys that enhanced rather than overwhelmed Amara's interests. She attended one of Amara's school concerts, sitting in the back row and applauding with tears in her eyes as her granddaughter played a simple piece on the school's upright piano. Most importantly, she made an effort to build a relationship with Keisha, understanding that the path to her granddaughter's heart went through the mother who had raised her with such love and care. "I owe you more than an apology," Eleanor said one afternoon when she had come to watch Amara's piano lesson. "I owe you a debt of gratitude. You raised her to be everything I could have hoped for in a granddaughter. You gave her confidence, kindness, and talent. You did it all alone, and you did it perfectly." "Not perfectly," Keisha replied, but she was touched by the sincerity in Eleanor's voice. "But I did my best. Your best was extraordinary, and I hope, if you'll let me, that I can spend the rest of my life making up for the years I missed." These conversations were slowly healing wounds that had seemed permanent, creating the possibility of a family dynamic that none of them had thought possible just months before. Meanwhile, Alexander and Keisha were navigating their own relationship with equal care and attention. They had decided to take things slowly to focus on co-parenting before exploring the romantic feelings that had never really disappeared. but it was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore the connection that sparked between them every time they were in the same room. When they laughed at something Amara said, when they exchanged knowing looks during her performances, when they worked together to solve parenting challenges, they felt like the team they had always been meant to be. "Sometimes I forget that we're not married," Alexander said one evening, as they cleaned up after dinner in Keisha's small kitchen. The domestic routine had become natural to them, a family ritual that felt as comfortable as breathing. "Is that something you think about?" Keisha asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "Being married?" "Every day," Alexander admitted. "Not because I think we need a piece of paper to be a family, but because I want to make promises to you that I intend to keep forever." The honesty in his voice made Keisha's heart race. "What kind of promises?" "To love you and Amara with everything I have. To put our family first always. To never let fear or outside pressure separate us again." He paused, then turned to face her fully. "To spend the rest of my life proving that we're stronger together than we could ever be apart." It wasn't a formal proposal, but it felt like one. And as Keisha looked into the eyes of the man she had never stopped loving, she realized that she was ready to believe in forever again. "I think," she said softly, "that those are exactly the kind of promises I'd like to hear." But before either of them could say more, Amara's voice interrupted from the living room. "Mama, Daddy, come listen to this new song I figured out." They found her at the small keyboard playing a melody that was entirely her own creation, something joyful and complex that seemed to capture all the happiness and security she felt in their newly complete family. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Alexander said, sitting down beside her. "What do you call it?" "I call it the family song," Amara replied matter-of-factly, "because it sounds like what home feels like." As they listened to their daughter's musical expression of love and belonging, Alexander and Keisha shared a look that needed no words. They had found their way back to each other, had built something beautiful from the ashes of old pain and misunderstanding. They were home. 6 months later, the Sterling family attended what would become Amara's first major public performance. The city's symphony orchestra was hosting a benefit concert for music education programs, and they had invited Amara to perform as a featured soloist. The invitation had come through Dr. Chen, who had continued to work with Amara on an informal basis, helping her develop her technique while preserving the natural joy and emotional authenticity that made her playing so special. "She's ready," Dr. Chen had told Alexander and Keisha. "Not just technically, but emotionally. She understands what music can do for people, and she wants to share that gift. This performance isn't about showing off. It's about service." The piece they had chosen was Alexander's composition, Amara's Song, which had been arranged for piano and orchestra by a composer friend who had been moved to tears when he first heard Amara play it. As they prepared backstage, Amara seemed remarkably calm for an 8-year-old about to perform with a professional orchestra. She wore a simple white dress with blue trim that matched her eyes, and her hair was styled in soft curls that made her look even younger than her years. "How are you feeling, baby?" Keisha asked, kneeling down to adjust Amara's dress one final time. "Happy?" Amara replied simply. "And grateful." "Grateful for what?" "For getting to share music with people, for having a family that loves me, for getting to play Daddy's song for everyone, so they can hear how much love sounds like." Alexander felt his throat tighten with emotion. This was why they had agreed to the performance, not for fame or recognition, but because Amara understood that her gift was meant to be shared, that music had the power to touch hearts and change lives. When her name was announced, Amara walked onto the stage with confidence that seemed remarkable in someone so young. She settled at the concert grand piano, adjusted the bench with the unconscious precision of someone who had grown up around instruments, and placed her hands on the keys. The opening notes of Amara's song rang out clear and pure, and the audience immediately fell under the spell of this extraordinary child, who played like she was channeling music from some divine source. But it wasn't just her technical perfection that moved the audience to tears. It was the story she told through every phrase, the love and hope and pure joy that poured from her fingers into music that seemed to heal something broken in everyone who heard it. The orchestra joined her seamlessly, their professional musicians following the lead of an 8-year-old who conducted them not with a baton, but with the sheer force of her musical conviction. Together, they created something that transcended performance and became a shared experience of beauty that left not a single dry eye in the concert hall. When the final notes faded into silence, the audience sat in stunned quiet for several heartbeats, as if they needed time to process what they had just witnessed. Then the applause began, starting slowly and building to a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. But the moment that would stay with Alexander and Keisha forever came when Amara stood to take her bow. Instead of looking out at the applauding audience, she turned toward the wings where her parents waited, and her face lit up with a smile that was pure love and gratitude. She had shared her gift with the world, but her first thought was for the family who had made it all possible. Later at the reception following the concert, they were surrounded by musicians, critics, and music educators who wanted to meet the remarkable child who had just redefined their understanding of what was possible in a young performer. "She's going to be famous," one renowned critic told them. "With talent like that and the emotional maturity she's already showing, she could have a significant career if that's what she chooses." But Alexander and Keisha barely heard the praise and predictions. They were watching Amara, who was politely accepting compliments, but kept looking toward the corner, where a group of children from underserved schools were eating refreshments provided by the benefit organizers. "Excuse me," Amara said to the critic who had been talking to her parents, "but I think those kids over there might want to try the piano. Would that be okay?" Without waiting for permission, she made her way over to the group of children, many of whom had never been to a symphony concert before tonight. Within minutes, she had them gathered around the piano in the reception area, teaching them simple melodies and encouraging them to experiment with the keys. "This is what music is really about," Alexander murmured to Keisha as they watched their daughter turn a formal reception into an impromptu music lesson. Not the performance, not the recognition. This, sharing the joy, making it accessible to everyone. "She gets that from you," Keisha said softly. "The understanding that gifts are meant to be shared, not hoarded." "She gets it from both of us," Alexander corrected. "The talent might be genetic, but the heart, the generosity, the desire to lift others up that comes from the way you raised her." As they watched Amara laugh with children who had probably never imagined they could make music themselves, Alexander and Keisha felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've raised a child who understands that true success isn't measured by personal achievement, but by how much joy you can bring to others. 1 year later, the Sterling family had settled into rhythms and traditions that felt as natural as breathing. Sunday mornings were still sacred time for just the three of them, but now they often included Eleanor, who had become not just a grandmother, but a cherished member of their inner circle. Amara, now 9 years old, continued to develop her musical gifts under careful guidance that prioritized her emotional well-being over professional advancement. She performed occasionally at charity events and educational programs, but always by choice, and always with the understanding that her childhood came first. More importantly, she had become the bridge that connected all the adults in her life, teaching them through her example how to love without conditions, how to forgive without keeping score, and how to build a family based on choice rather than obligation. "You know what I love most about our family," Amara said one evening, as they sat together after dinner, Alexander and Keisha on either side of her on the couch, Eleanor in her favorite chair nearby. "What's that, sweetheart?" Keisha asked. "We all chose each other. I mean, I know Daddy and I are related by blood, and Grandma Eleanor is too, but we all decided we wanted to be together. That makes it special." "It does make it special," Alexander agreed, pulling his daughter closer. "Sometimes, the best families are the ones we build on purpose with intention and love." "Like music," Amara added with the wisdom that had always surprised the adults around her. "The most beautiful music happens when everyone chooses to play together in harmony." As they sat in their warm living room, surrounded by the evidence of a life built on love and second chances, photos from concerts and family vacations, children's artwork on the refrigerator, musical instruments scattered around like beloved pets, Alexander reflected on how dramatically his definition of success had changed. Once, he had measured his worth by profit margins and stock prices by the size of his office and the deference of his employees. Now he measured it by his daughter's laughter, by the trust in his wife's eyes, by the knowledge that he was exactly where he belonged. "I have an announcement," he said suddenly, feeling the rightness of the moment settle around him like a perfect chord resolution. Everyone turned to look at him with curious expressions. "I've been thinking about this for months, and I've finally made a decision. I'm stepping back from day-to-day operations at Sterling Enterprises. I'm going to focus on the Foundation's education initiatives and spend more time with the two most important people in my life." Keisha's eyes widened with surprise and something that looked like relief. "Are you sure the company means so much to you?" "The company was what I did before I knew what really mattered," Alexander said simply. "Now I know. This is what matters. You and Amara and the life we're building together. Everything else is just details." "Does this mean you'll be home more?" Amara asked, and there was hope in her voice that made Alexander's heart ache with love. "Much more," he promised. "Enough to give you all the piano lessons you want, enough to attend every school concert and parent-teacher conference, enough to make up for some of the time we lost." "We didn't lose anything," Amara said with the certainty of a child who had never known anything but love. "We just took a long time to find each other. But we found each other in the end, and that's what matters." Later that evening, after Amara was asleep and Eleanor had returned to her own home, Alexander and Keisha sat together on their back porch, listening to the sounds of their neighborhood settling into night. They had been married for 6 months now, in a small ceremony attended only by their closest family and friends. But it was moments like this, quiet conversations in the darkness, that felt most married to both of them. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had been different?" Keisha asked, her head resting on Alexander's shoulder. "If your mother hadn't interfered, if I hadn't been so scared, if we had raised Amara together from the beginning." "Sometimes," Alexander admitted. "But then I think about who Amara is now, how strong and compassionate and wise she is, and I wonder if she needed exactly the journey she had to become exactly who she's meant to be." "You think everything happens for a reason?" "I think love finds a way," Alexander said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I think some connections are too strong to stay broken forever. I think we were always meant to be a family. We just took the long way around." "The scenic route," Keisha murmured with a smile in her voice. "The most beautiful scenic route in history." From inside the house, they could hear the faint sound of Amara practicing piano in her room, working on a new composition she was writing for her school's spring concert. The melody was hopeful and complex, like a musical representation of their family's journey from separation to reunion. "She's going to change the world," Keisha said softly. "She already has," Alexander replied. "She changed ours." As they sat together in the darkness, surrounded by the evidence of a life rebuilt on love and forgiveness, both of them understood that their story wasn't really about music or talent or overcoming obstacles. It was about the power of connection to survive, separation, the ability of love to heal old wounds, and the miracle that happens when people are brave enough to choose each other again and again. The next morning brought news that would test their newly solid foundation in an unexpected way. Alexander's phone rang early while they were still having breakfast, and the voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Chen. "Alexander, I hope I'm not calling too early, but I have an opportunity I wanted to discuss with you and Keisha. The London Symphony Orchestra is putting together a special program featuring young prodigies from around the world. They've heard recordings of Amara's performances, and they're inviting her to participate in their summer festival." Alexander felt his stomach clench with immediate anxiety. London was thousands of miles away, and Amara was only 9 years old. The idea of their daughter traveling internationally for performances felt like too much too soon. "Dr. Chen, I appreciate the invitation, but Amara is still very young for something like that. I understand your concerns, and they're valid. But this isn't a competitive program or a pressure-filled situation. It's more like a musical summer camp with world-class instruction and the opportunity for these gifted children to learn from each other. The families are invited to participate as well. It could be a wonderful experience for all of you." Alexander looked across the breakfast table at Keisha, who was listening to his side of the conversation with growing interest, and at Amara, who was pretending to focus on her cereal but was clearly eavesdropping. "Can we think about it?" he asked. "Of course, but I should mention the deadline for applications is next week. If you're interested, we'll need to move quickly." After Alexander hung up, the three of them sat in silence for a moment, each processing the implications of this unexpected opportunity. "London," Amara said finally, her voice filled with wonder. "With other kids who play music like me." "It would be a big adventure," Keisha said carefully. "Far from home with people we don't know." "But we'd all go together?" Amara asked, looking back and forth between her parents. "If we decided to do it, yes," Alexander confirmed. "We'd never send you anywhere alone." Amara's face scrunched up in the expression she wore when she was thinking through complex problems. "Would it help me become a better musician?" "Probably," Keisha admitted. "Being around other talented young people, learning from different teachers, experiencing music from other cultures, it would all expand your understanding. But more importantly," Alexander added, "how do you feel about it? Does it sound exciting or scary?" "Both," Amara said honestly. "But maybe that's good. Maybe the best adventures are supposed to feel both exciting and scary." That afternoon, they made a family trip to the public library, where they checked out books about London, about the London Symphony Orchestra, and about the summer music programs that brought young musicians together from around the world. As they read together, spreading the books across their living room floor, like pieces of a puzzle they were trying to solve, Amara's excitement began to build. "Look," she said, pointing to a photograph of young violinists from Japan, performing with cellists from Brazil and pianists from South Africa. "They're all different, but they're making music together. That's like what music is supposed to do, right? Bring people together, even when they're different." "That's exactly what music is supposed to do," Alexander agreed. "And that's exactly the kind of experience we'd want you to have." "But only if you want it," Keisha added. "Only if it feels right to you." Amara was quiet for a long moment, studying the photographs of young musicians who looked happy and confident and excited about sharing their gifts with each other. "I think I want to try," she said finally. "I think it would be good for me to meet other kids who understand what it feels like to have music living inside you all the time." The decision to accept the London invitation was made as a family, with everyone's concerns addressed and everyone's excitement acknowledged. Eleanor, when told about the opportunity, immediately offered to help with travel arrangements and to provide contacts in London who could assist if any problems arose. "I'm so proud of all of you," she said as they finalized their plans. 8 months ago, I didn't even know Amara existed. Now I'm watching her prepare for an international music festival supported by parents who are putting her well-being ahead of any other consideration. It's exactly what every child deserves. The weeks leading up to their departure were filled with preparation, both practical and emotional. Amara worked with Dr. Chen to prepare pieces that would showcase her abilities while remaining true to her musical personality. Alexander arranged for extended time away from his business responsibilities. Keisha coordinated with Amara's school to ensure she wouldn't fall behind academically. But perhaps most importantly, they talked constantly about expectations about what success would look like, about how to handle homesickness or disappointment if things didn't go as planned. The goal isn't to be the best musician there, Alexander explained one evening as they reviewed the program schedule. The goal is to learn to grow and to make friends with other kids who love music as much as you do. And if it gets overwhelming, Amara asked. Then we come home, Keisha said simply. No questions asked, no disappointment, no pressure to stick it out if it's not working for you. This safety net, this absolute assurance that her parents would prioritize her well-being over any external expectations, gave Amara the confidence to approach the experience with excitement rather than anxiety. The London program exceeded all their expectations. Amara found herself in the company of young musicians whose talents matched her own, but whose cultural backgrounds and musical traditions offered perspectives she had never encountered. She learned traditional folk songs from a 10-year-old Irish fiddler, collaborated on a jazz improvisation with a 12-year-old American drummer, and performed a classical duet with a 9-year-old German pianist, whose technical precision complemented her own emotional expressiveness perfectly. But more than the musical education, it was the social experience that proved most valuable. For the first time in her life, Amara was surrounded by peers who understood what it felt like to hear music constantly, who didn't think it was strange to wake up with melodies in your head or to see colors when certain chords were played. They get it, she told her parents one evening as they had dinner in their London hotel. They understand that music isn't just something you do, it's something you are. Alexander and Keisha, meanwhile, found themselves learning as much as their daughter. They attended workshops for parents of gifted children, participated in discussions about balancing talent development with normal childhood experiences, and connected with other families who were navigating similar challenges. It's reassuring, Keisha said to Alexander one evening as they walked along the Thames after Amara had fallen asleep, to know that other parents struggle with the same questions we do. How much is too much? How do you support exceptional talent without creating pressure? How do you keep your child grounded while acknowledging that they're extraordinary? And it's even more reassuring, Alexander replied, to see that we're making good choices. Amara is thriving here, but she's still essentially the same happy, well-adjusted kid she was at home. We haven't created a little monster or a burned-out prodigy. We've just given her opportunities to grow. The culminating performance of the London program was held at the Royal Albert Hall, with each young musician performing solo pieces, and then joining together for a final ensemble piece that had been arranged specifically for the group. When Amara walked onto that legendary stage, wearing a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes, and carrying herself with the quiet confidence that had become her trademark, Alexander and Keisha felt a pride that had nothing to do with achievement and everything to do with character. She played Amara's song, the piece her father had written for her, but it had evolved during her time in London. She had incorporated elements she had learned from her new friends, subtle rhythmic variations inspired by the Irish fiddler harmonic complexities, influenced by the jazz drummer dynamic contrasts learned from the German pianist. The piece had become a musical autobiography of her growth, a sonic representation of how she had been changed by exposure to new perspectives while remaining fundamentally herself. When the final ensemble piece brought all the young musicians together on stage, creating a sound that was both unified and diverse, representing the best of what happened when talented individuals chose to collaborate rather than compete. There wasn't a dry eye in the audience. But the moment that would stay with Alexander and Keisha forever came at the very end, when all the young performers were taking their final bows. Amara found her parents in the audience and blew them a kiss, her face radiant with joy and gratitude. She had shared her gift with an international audience, had grown as both a musician and a person, had made friendships that would last a lifetime. But her first instinct was still to connect with the family who had made it all possible. As they flew home to New York, Amara curled up between her parents on the plane, exhausted but happy, already making plans for how she would share what she had learned with her friends at home. "Was it everything you hoped it would be?" Keisha asked softly, stroking her daughter's hair. "It was more," Amara murmured sleepily. "But you know what the best part was?" "What?" "Knowing that no matter how far away I went or how many new people I met, I always had you to come home to. That made me feel brave enough to try everything." Alexander felt his throat tighten with emotion. This was what they had been building toward all along. Not just musical success or educational opportunities, but the kind of security that would allow their daughter to explore the world with confidence, knowing that she was loved unconditionally and that home would always be waiting for her. 2 years later, as Amara approached her 11th birthday, the Sterling family had found a rhythm that balanced her continuing musical development with the normal experiences of childhood. She still studied with advanced teachers and performed occasionally at special events, but she also played soccer, took art classes, and spent time with friends who had nothing to do with music. The key, Dr. Chen had told them during one of their regular consultations, is remembering that Amara is a child first and a musician second. The music will always be there, but childhood is finite and precious. This philosophy had guided their decisions about opportunities and commitments, ensuring that Amara's gifts were nurtured without overwhelming her life or defining her entire identity. On a quiet Saturday morning in spring, the family was gathered in their music room, not for a formal lesson, but for the kind of spontaneous music making that had become their favorite form of family bonding. Amara was at the piano. Alexander was playing violin, a skill he had taken up again, after years of focusing solely on piano, and Keisha was singing, her voice as beautiful as it had been during her conservatory days. They were working on a piece that Amara had been composing, a musical setting of a poem she had written about family. It was complex enough to challenge all their skills, but accessible enough that Eleanor, who had joined them for the weekend, could follow along and occasionally add her own voice to the harmony. "You know what this reminds me of?" Eleanor said during a pause in the music. "What?" Amara asked, always eager to hear her grandmother's stories. "It reminds me of why music exists in the first place. Not for competitions or careers or recognition, but for moments like this. For families coming together and creating something beautiful that didn't exist before." "Is that why you think I'm good at music?" Amara asked, with the directness that had always characterized her questions. "Because our family loves it so much. I think you're good at music," Eleanor replied thoughtfully. "Because you understand that it's a language for expressing things that are too big for regular words. Love, joy, hope, connection. You've always understood that music is about bringing people together. But I also think," Alexander added, "that you're good at music because you work hard, and because you never forget that the goal is to create beauty, not to impress people." "And I think," Keisha said, pulling her daughter close, "that you're good at music because you have a heart big enough to hold all the feelings that music can express, and generous enough to share those feelings with everyone who hears you play." Amara considered all these explanations with the seriousness she brought to important questions. "I think maybe I'm good at music because I had teachers who taught me that being good at something isn't about being better than other people. It's about being the best version of yourself and using your gifts to make other people happy. The wisdom in her statement silenced the adults for a moment. At 11 years old, Amara had internalized lessons about talent, purpose, and service that many professional musicians never learned. "You're right," Alexander said finally, "and that understanding is going to serve you well no matter what you choose to do with your life." "What if I don't want to be a professional musician when I grow up?" Amara asked, voicing a question that had been on her mind lately. "What if I want to be a teacher or a doctor or something else?" "Then you'll be a teacher or a doctor who happens to play piano beautifully," Keisha said without hesitation. "Your music will always be part of who you are, but it doesn't have to be your job." "The goal," Alexander added, "is for you to become whoever you're meant to be with music as one of the tools you use to make the world better." "Can I tell you a secret?" Amara said, looking around at the family that had given her so much love and support. "Always," they said in unison. "Sometimes I think about becoming a music teacher like Dr. Chen, but for little kids who don't have money for lessons. I think it would be fun to help them discover that they have music inside them too." The adults exchanged looks of pride and recognition. This was exactly the kind of purpose-driven thinking they had hoped to encourage, the understanding that gifts were meant to be shared and that true fulfillment came from service to others. "I think that sounds like a perfect way to use your talents," Eleanor said with tears in her eyes. "And I think you'll be an extraordinary teacher because you'll understand how to make music accessible and joyful for everyone." As they returned to their family music making, playing Amara's composition about the different kinds of love that held families together, each of them felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. Alexander had found the family he had unknowingly been searching for his entire life. Keisha had learned to trust in love again and had seen her daughter's gifts flourish in ways she had never imagined possible. Eleanor had discovered that the greatest legacy wasn't money or social position, but the love that connected generations. And Amara had grown up surrounded by examples of what it meant to use your talents in service of others, to choose love over fear, and to understand that the most beautiful music comes from harmony between different voices. Outside, spring was turning toward summer, and the music room was filled with golden afternoon light that seemed to dance along with their melodies. In this room where everything had begun, where a 7-year-old girl had first touched piano keys and changed 3 lives forever, a family continued to grow and create and love together. Their story had begun with music, but it had become something larger, a testament to the power of second chances, the importance of forgiveness, and the miracle that happens when people are brave enough to choose each other over and over again. Where are you listening from today? Alexander found himself thinking as they played, imagining the people who might someday hear their story. What connections are you missing in your own life? What conversations have you been afraid to have? What opportunities for love are you overlooking because they don't look the way you expected them to? Because ultimately, their story wasn't about extraordinary musical talent or unusual circumstances. It was about the universal human capacity for love to heal old wounds, for families to be rebuilt stronger than before, and for every person, regardless of age or situation, to find the courage to reach for the happiness they deserved. In a mansion that had once echoed with loneliness, a family of 4 sat around a piano creating music that told the story of how love had found its way home. And in that music was the promise that no matter how lost we might feel, no matter how impossible our circumstances might seem, there is always the possibility that the next note we play might be the beginning of something beautiful. Sometimes the most important moves in life aren't made on a stage or in a boardroom, but in quiet moments when families choose to love each other without reservation. Sometimes the greatest victories happen not in front of applauding audiences, but in living rooms and kitchens where people decide to trust in the possibility of happiness. And sometimes the most beautiful music comes not from perfect technique or flawless performance, but from the simple harmony that results when people who belong together finally find their way home. If this story has touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Like this video to help us reach more people who might be inspired by Amara's journey. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us what really matters in life. And remember, sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones we almost missed. Sometimes the family we're meant to have is waiting for us to be brave enough to claim it. Click on the video appearing on your screen now for another incredible story about the power of love to transform lives. Until next time, keep believing in the magic that happens when people choose to love each other without reservation.